Hello, my dear friends. Let us move slowly now into medieval Europe, into a world of stone castles, long corridors lit by torches, and kingdoms that depended not on elections or laws, but on family blood. The night air is cool, and mist rests across the fields outside high castle walls. Inside, servants prepare fires while nobles wake beneath heavy blankets. In this world, a person's birth mattered more than almost anything else. Who your parents were decided where you lived, what you ate, who you married, and even whether armies might one day fight in your name. For royal women, this reality shaped every part of life from the moment they were born. In the Middle Ages, rulers believed stability came from keeping power within the same family. A kingdom was not seen as a country in the modern sense. It was closer to property, land held by a dynasty. If a ruler died without a clear heir, nobles could argue, rival families could claim the throne, and wars could begin quickly. Because of this, marriages were arranged carefully. Love was not the goal. Security was the goal. To secure alliances, royal families often married relatives. At first, this seemed practical. A king trusted his own blood more than strangers. A princess marrying a cousin meant land stayed connected and loyalty stayed predictable. Over time, however, this practice repeated again and again across generations. Girls born into these families rarely had a choice. From childhood, they understood their future already decided. Tutors taught them languages, religion, and court etiquette, not to prepare them for independence, but to prepare them for marriage diplomacy. By the age of 12 or 13, many were already promised to a relative they had never met. Inside castles, their daily life looked calm. They practiced embroidery, read religious texts, and learned to speak politely to visiting nobles. Yet beneath this quiet routine lay constant expectation. They were not raised primarily to rule or even to advise. Their most important role was to produce heirs, preferably sons, who would continue the same family line. Because of repeated cousin marriages, royal genealogies became tightly connected. Family trees did not branch widely outward. They folded inward. A princess might discover that her future husband was also her second cousin, her third cousin, and related again through another grandparent. Nobles did not see this as strange. To them, shared blood meant shared legitimacy. However, this system carried consequences they did not fully understand. Medieval people lacked modern knowledge of genetics. They did not know why some children were frequently ill, or why certain traits repeated strongly across generations. When royal children were born weak or sickly, explanations were often religious. Some believed God was testing the family. Others believed the child required special prayer. Few recognized the connection to repeated close marriages. For women, this created a quiet pressure. If a child was unhealthy, blame often fell upon the mother, not the marriage arrangement. Chroniclers sometimes recorded that a queen had a weak constitution, even when the true cause lay in the family line itself. A woman's reputation depended on producing strong heirs, yet she had no control over the biological reality shaping the outcome. Let us imagine a young princess walking slowly through a castle gallery lined with tapestries. She knows she will leave this home soon to marry a man chosen for political reasons. She may have met him only once, perhaps not at all. The journey will be long. She will move to a foreign court where language and customs differ. Yet what matters most to those around her is simple. She must continue the bloodline. Some queens adapted well, forming friendships and learning influence within court life. Others lived quietly and privately, surrounded by attendants but far from family. Letters became their connection to childhood homes. Many spent long hours in prayer, partly from faith and partly from the hope of a safe childbirth. Childbirth itself was one of the most dangerous moments in medieval life. Even in royal households with physicians and attendants, risks were high. A successful birth brought celebration across the kingdom. Bells rang, feasts were held, and gifts distributed. But repeated pregnancies were expected. Producing only one child was not considered secure succession. The cycle continued again and again. Across Europe, in England, France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, the same pattern appeared. Royal families intermarried, sometimes across borders but often within the same extended relatives. Over generations, portraits began to show similar facial features shared among distant courts. Chroniclers noticed resemblance but interpreted it as noble heritage rather than inherited concentration. Inside their chambers, however, the queens themselves experienced the reality directly. Many faced fragile health, long recoveries after childbirth, and anxiety about each pregnancy. Yet outwardly, they maintained composure. Royal dignity required calm behavior even during hardship. As evening settles over the castle and candlelight flickers across stone walls, we see how these women lived within a system larger than themselves. They were respected, honored, and surrounded by ceremony, yet their personal choices remained few. Their marriages held kingdoms together but also quietly shaped the future health of royal families. And as the corridors grow silent and the guards begin their night watch, we remain within this medieval world, ready to continue our slow journey into the lives of specific queens whose stories reveal how deeply these family ties affected generations of rulers. Let us continue our quiet walk through medieval Europe, moving now from the general world of castles and dynasties into a more personal space, the early childhood of a royal girl born into one of these tightly connected families. Her birth is not greeted simply as the arrival of a child, but as the arrival of political possibility. Messengers ride to neighboring courts. Letters are written to relatives who are also allies. And priests offer prayers not only for her health but for the future plans already forming around her. From the beginning, she is surrounded by familiarity. The people visiting the castle are often relatives in multiple ways at once. An uncle may also be a cousin. A visiting queen might be related through both her mother and father. The family network stretches across borders, but it circles back repeatedly to the same ancestors. Portraits hanging on the walls show faces that look similar generation after generation, and no one finds this unusual. To the court, resemblance confirms noble lineage and strengthens claims to power. Her nursery is comfortable and protected, filled with nurses, attendants, and tutors. Yet even in this safe space, her upbringing is shaped by expectation. She is taught languages early, often Latin for religion and sometimes French for diplomacy. She learns prayer, courtesy, and obedience. She does not run freely through fields as peasant children might. Instead, her play is quiet and supervised, preparing her for formal court life. As she grows older, conversations around her slowly change. Adults begin speaking about alliances, neighboring kingdoms, and possible marriages. She may not understand the meaning fully, but she recognizes that her future is connected to people she has never met. Often those future husbands belong to the same extended family circle. A cousin in another court becomes the preferred choice because it keeps property, influence, and inheritance within trusted bloodlines. By the time she reaches early adolescence, portraits of her are sent to other courts. Artists paint her carefully, presenting an image of health and dignity. The portrait travels farther than she ever has, carried by envoys who negotiate marriage terms. Gifts accompany these discussions, fabrics, jewels, and letters written in respectful language. The agreement, once reached, is celebrated like a treaty between kingdoms, because it truly is one. She then prepares to leave her childhood home. The journey is long and solemn. She travels with a procession of attendants, priests, and guards. Along the roads, villages gather to watch her pass. For them, she represents distant royalty, but for herself, she represents duty. She knows she may never again see the place where she was raised. When she arrives at the new court, she meets her husband formally. He may be kind or distant, but what matters to those around them is that the marriage is legitimate and recognized by church and nobles. The ceremony is elaborate, filled with music and feasting. Yet after the celebration, ordinary routine begins. She learns the customs of the new household, adjusts to a different language or dialect, and studies the expectations placed upon her as queen or consort. Soon attention turns to childbirth. Every month without pregnancy causes quiet concern. Physicians suggest diets and tonics. Priests hold prayers for fertility. Relics are brought to her chamber for blessing. The entire court watches carefully because succession determines stability. If no heir appears, rivals may begin to speak more boldly. When a pregnancy is announced, relief spreads across the castle. Bells ring and letters go out across Europe informing relatives, many of whom are connected through the same family lines. The queen receives greater care, but also greater pressure. Everyone hopes for a healthy son, not only for family pride, but to avoid conflict after the king's death. Yet pregnancies in these families often carry uncertainty. Some children are born weak, others fall ill easily, and some do not survive infancy. Without understanding heredity, people interpret these tragedies spiritually. Fasting, prayer, and pilgrimages are organized. The queen herself may feel responsible, even though the marriage arrangement lies beyond her control. Through these experiences, her daily life becomes one of patience and resilience. She attends ceremonies, receives visitors, and appears publicly with calm dignity, even when privately worried. Chroniclers write of her grace and piety, unaware of the quiet fears she carries with each pregnancy. Night falls once more across the castle courtyard. Torches burn along the walls and guards take their positions. Inside, she sits near a window looking at the distant lights of the town beyond the gates. She is honored, respected, and surrounded by luxury, yet she lives within a system that has already chosen her path. Her role connects kingdoms, but it also binds her to expectations she cannot change. And so we continue gently forward, staying within this medieval world of alliances and inheritance, as we begin to see how the repeated marriages within royal families slowly shaped not only politics, but the lives and health of the women at the center of these dynasties. Now let us move closer to one of the great ruling houses of medieval and early modern Europe, the family that perhaps best shows how these repeated royal marriages shaped real lives, the Habsburg dynasty. Their land stretched across mountains, rivers, and distant cities. They ruled parts of Spain, Austria, the Low Countries, and territories of the Holy Roman Empire. To them, the greatest danger was not invasion, but division. If their lands were split among different families, their power would weaken. So they chose a solution they believed safe. They married within their own extended relatives again and again. Inside their palaces, the routine looked dignified and peaceful. Courtyards filled with fountains, chapels echoed with daily prayer, and galleries displayed portraits of ancestors. But those portraits revealed something slowly repeating. Faces across generations shared similar features: narrow jaws, long faces, and familiar expressions. To contemporaries, this resemblance proved noble purity. They spoke proudly of keeping the blood strong, not realizing what that repetition would eventually bring. A princess born into this family grew up surrounded almost entirely by relatives. Her mother, a Habsburg princess herself, was often related to her father before the marriage ever occurred. Visiting nobles were not strangers but cousins. Even letters from foreign courts were frequently written by kin. From childhood, she understood that her future husband would likely come from the same network. She was not leaving family. She was moving to another branch of it. Her education was careful and serious. She learned multiple languages because the dynasty ruled many regions. She practiced religious devotion deeply, as the family believed their authority came from divine approval. Hours were spent in prayer, instruction from tutors, and formal appearances beside her parents. Outwardly, she lived a protected life of ceremony, but inwardly she carried the knowledge that her value lay in continuing the lineage. When the time came for marriage, negotiations did not involve distant kingdoms first. Instead, relatives were considered the most reliable partners. A cousin might inherit neighboring lands, and uniting through marriage prevented conflict. The church allowed such unions with special permission, called a dispensation, because normally close relatives were forbidden to marry. Yet for royal houses, these permissions were granted frequently. After the wedding, her role intensified. The court observed her closely, watching for signs of pregnancy. If months passed without success, physicians proposed remedies. They recommended special diets, herbal tonics, and periods of rest. Religious processions were organized. She prayed before relics and saints believed to protect mothers. Everyone understood that the dynasty's future depended on the child she might bear. When children arrived, joy filled the palace, but worry often followed quietly. Some infants were delicate and required constant care. Chroniclers described illnesses that lasted weeks or months. Without modern understanding, doctors blamed humors of the body or seasonal imbalance. Few recognized that repeated cousin marriages increased the chance of inherited weakness. For the mother, this meant continuous emotional strain. Each pregnancy brought hope but also fear. She fulfilled her duty faithfully, appearing in public ceremonies, greeting ambassadors, and writing letters to relatives who were also political allies. Yet private letters sometimes revealed exhaustion. She prayed not only for a son but for a child who would survive and grow strong. Court life around her remained formal. She attended banquets seated beside nobles who were also extended family. Conversations revolved around alliances, territories, and inheritance rights. Even celebrations reminded her of responsibility. Every feast marked not only happiness, but expectation. As years passed, the repetition of marriages became clearer to observers. Family trees began to resemble circles rather than branches. The same ancestors appeared repeatedly within a single generation's lineage. Still, rulers hesitated to change tradition. Trust in family seemed safer than risking marriage to an uncertain foreign power. Inside her private chamber, however, the reality felt different. She experienced the physical toll of repeated pregnancies and the emotional burden of uncertainty about her children's health. Attendants comforted her, priests offered prayer, and physicians monitored her condition. But the system itself continued unchanged. The evening quiet returns to the palace now. Candles flicker along stone corridors and servants close heavy doors against the night air. In her chamber, she kneels before a small altar, praying softly for the safety of her children and the peace of the lands her family governs. She does not question openly the marriages arranged around her. Instead, she fulfills the role expected of her, believing stability for her people depends on the same bloodline continuing. And as darkness settles over the palace rooftops, we begin to understand how these royal women lived at the center of power, yet carried burdens invisible to chroniclers. Their lives shaped by a tradition meant to preserve kingdoms, but one that slowly altered the very families it sought to protect. Let us remain within the Habsburg world a little longer, because here the pattern becomes clearer when we look at one particular royal woman whose life quietly reflected the entire system. Juana of Castile, often remembered later by the nickname Juana the Mad. When she was born in 1479, her arrival was celebrated across Spain. She was the daughter of two powerful rulers, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the monarchs who had unified large parts of Spain. From the beginning, her life was not her own. She was a political connection, a living bridge between dynasties. Her childhood was structured and disciplined. Unlike some princesses, she received a strong education. She studied Latin, music, religion, and court behavior. Those who met her described her as intelligent and thoughtful, even quiet. She enjoyed reading and reflection more than court festivities. Yet even while she studied, plans were already forming around her future marriage. The choice fell upon Philip of Burgundy, also called Philip the Handsome. He belonged to the Habsburg family, which meant their marriage would unite Spanish and Habsburg territories into a vast alliance. The decision pleased rulers across Europe. It strengthened influence and reduced the chance of war between powerful families. For Juana, however, it meant leaving Spain permanently and entering a foreign court. Her journey north was long and solemn. Ships carried her across rough seas, and she traveled with attendants, priests, and nobles. When she arrived, the Burgundian court felt different from Spain. The language, clothing, and customs changed. The court was lively, filled with dances and tournaments, far more social than the quiet Spanish court she knew. She adapted, but she lived among strangers. Philip and Juana produced several children, and each birth held enormous political importance. Their children would inherit territories across Europe. But the marriage itself was not peaceful. Philip spent long periods away and maintained close friendships at court that caused her distress. In a world where queens depended on stable marriage to maintain influence, this uncertainty weighed heavily on her. At the same time, the dynastic web tightened. Many of their relatives were connected through repeated family unions. The future rulers of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire would come from this same line. Juana's children would themselves marry cousins, continuing the pattern already established. After the deaths of her mother Isabella and later her father Ferdinand, Juana technically became Queen of Castile, yet she never ruled independently. Political leaders declared her incapable of governing and confined her within guarded residences. Historians debate the reasons. Some believe her emotional distress following Philip's death was interpreted harshly by those who wanted control of the kingdom. Others suggest prolonged stress and isolation affected her deeply. Whatever the cause, she spent many years separated from power. Her story shows something important. Royal women in these dynasties were central to inheritance but rarely allowed authority equal to their importance. Their marriages created empires, their children shaped the future, yet political decisions often excluded them. When problems arose, they were described personally rather than politically. Within her residence, she lived quietly. Attendants cared for her, priests visited, and letters passed occasionally between relatives who were also rulers. Outside, her children rose to immense power. Her son, Charles V, would become one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, ruling vast territories across continents. Yet she herself remained distant from that authority, remembered more as a symbol than as a participant. Evening again falls across stone courtyards. Guards patrol the gates while candlelight glows behind thick walls. Within her chamber, she spends long hours in prayer and reflection. The world beyond continues to change. Wars, alliances, and treaties, all connected to the same family line that shaped her life. Through Juana, we see the deeper reality of dynastic marriage. The system aimed to create stability by joining relatives again and again. It succeeded politically for a time, forming one of the largest empires Europe had known. But for the women at its center, life often meant isolation, expectation, and quiet endurance rather than the authority their titles suggested. And as the night grows still around her residence, we move forward in our journey, understanding that her children and grandchildren would carry this pattern even further, tightening the family circle until its consequences could no longer remain unnoticed. As we continue forward through the generations, the family circle tightens even further. And nowhere does this become more visible than in the later Spanish Habsburg queens. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the marriage patterns that began as political convenience had become tradition so deeply rooted that few questioned it. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, double cousin unions became common. Each alliance was explained as necessary for unity, for stability, for the preservation of inherited lands. Yet with every repetition, the same ancestors appeared again and again within a single lineage. Let us step into the life of Margaret of Austria, a Habsburg princess born into this tightly woven network. From childhood, she was surrounded almost entirely by relatives. Her grandparents were connected through earlier cousin marriages. Her aunts were queens in neighboring courts, yet also blood relations. Even distant rulers who sent her gifts were part of the extended family web. To her, this was normal. The entire map of Europe felt like one vast family tree. Her upbringing was disciplined and refined. She learned languages, music, religious devotion, and the subtle art of court diplomacy. Portraits painted of her showed the distinctive Habsburg features already familiar in the family. A strong jawline, long face, and carefully composed expression. These were not seen as flaws at the time. They were signs of recognizable lineage, proof that the bloodline remained pure. When she married, it was again within this familiar circle. The ceremony united territories already connected by blood. Letters celebrating the marriage traveled across Europe, filled with phrases about strengthening bonds and preserving peace. Yet beneath the formal language, the biological closeness of the union went largely unnoticed by those arranging it. Her pregnancies were closely watched. The court physicians monitored her health carefully, aware that previous generations had seen fragile infants. Although they did not understand genetic inheritance, they noticed patterns. Children sometimes struggled with illnesses from a young age. Some displayed physical features identical to portraits of earlier ancestors, almost as if time itself repeated within their faces. For a queen in such a position, daily life involved constant prayer and public composure. She attended Mass each morning, walked through palace galleries lined with portraits of her relatives, and received ambassadors who often bowed not only to her crown, but to her bloodline. Her existence represented continuity, yet she lived within a system that gave her little space to question its structure. As generations continued, the circle narrowed further. By the time we reached the 17th century, the Spanish Habsburg line had repeated close marriages so frequently that modern historians can calculate their family trees as nearly overlapping entirely. One later queen, Mariana of Austria, married her own uncle, King Philip IV of Spain. Such unions required special permission from the church, but those permissions were routinely granted for dynastic reasons. Mariana's life reflects the emotional complexity of this system. She was young when she married, raised in a household where nearly everyone was related. Entering Spain as queen, she understood that her duty was to produce a male heir to secure the dynasty. The court treated her respectfully, yet every month without pregnancy created anxiety. When she finally bore children, celebrations were grand, yet many of her infants were delicate. Some did not survive early childhood. Her surviving son, Charles II of Spain, became one of the most famous examples of the long-term consequences of repeated inbreeding. His health struggles were severe, and modern analysis suggests that generations of close marriages contributed significantly to his condition. But within his mother's lifetime, explanations remained spiritual or moral rather than biological. For Mariana, daily life meant balancing political responsibility with maternal fear. She ruled as regent during her son's minority, making decisions in a court filled with powerful male advisors. Despite the system that restricted women's authority, she exercised influence where she could. Yet she could not change the marriage patterns that had shaped her own union and would shape the next. Inside her private chambers, she prayed constantly for her son's strength. Letters to relatives often carried concern masked by polite language. She knew the dynasty depended on him. She also knew, though perhaps only quietly, that the same system designed to preserve their power might have weakened it. As candlelight flickers in the Spanish palace and the sound of distant footsteps echoes across marble floors, we see the result of generations of tightly bound family lines. What began as political strategy had become tradition, and tradition had become identity. To abandon it would mean admitting that the system itself carried risk. And so the pattern continued for as long as it could, until the health of the dynasty itself forced Europe to confront the cost of preserving bloodlines too carefully. Within the quiet rooms of these queens, beyond the formal portraits and ceremonial robes, their lives carried the weight of decisions made long before they were born. The night deepens now across palace rooftops, and within those dim corridors the story of these royal women continues. Dignified, burdened, and inseparable from the family trees that shaped their fate. As we move gently forward, we remain in the later years of the Spanish Habsburg world, where the consequences of generations of carefully arranged marriages became impossible to ignore, even if people of the time could not explain them scientifically. Within the vast royal palace in Madrid, life still followed strict routine. Courtiers bowed in corridors, priests conducted daily mass, and officials debated matters of taxation and war. Yet behind the ceremony there existed a constant quiet concern centered on the royal nursery. Queen Mariana of Austria now spent much of her day within private chambers rather than public halls. Her role had changed from bride to mother, and the future of the dynasty rested almost entirely upon the health of her surviving child, the young Prince Charles. The court treated the boy with extraordinary care. Physicians examined him frequently, attendants watched his movements, and tutors approached his lessons slowly. Every small improvement in his condition was celebrated. Every illness brought fear across the palace. Mariana's routine reflected this tension. Each morning she attended Mass and prayed for stability, not only political stability, but the simple stability of her son's health. She kept relics and religious images close, believing divine protection might help where human knowledge could not. In the afternoon she met advisors, for she governed as regent while her son was too young to rule. Though a woman in a male-dominated political world, she demonstrated patience and persistence, listening carefully to counsels before making decisions. Her authority existed, but it always carried the shadow of uncertainty about succession. Meanwhile, the wider royal family across Europe watched closely. Because so many royal houses were connected through the same ancestors, the health of one heir affected many kingdoms. Letters arrived constantly from Vienna and other courts, offering advice, concern, and sometimes subtle political pressure. These were not merely relatives expressing affection. They were rulers calculating the future balance of power. The young prince grew slowly. His physical development was delayed and chronic illness kept him indoors for long periods. Courtiers adapted ceremonies to accommodate him. Celebrations were quieter, movements slower, expectations cautious. Chroniclers wrote carefully, describing his condition respectfully without open criticism. Yet observers recognized the fragility of the situation. For Mariana, this created a life of constant vigilance. She balanced statecraft with motherhood, attending councils by day and sitting beside her son in the evening. She supervised his meals, consulted physicians, and ordered prayers across the kingdom. Her public image remained calm and dignified, but private letters suggest deep worry. She understood that the dynasty's future depended on a single child whose health remained uncertain. Beyond Spain, other courts quietly prepared for possible change. Diplomatic marriages were discussed, alliances reconsidered, and inheritance claims reviewed. The entire political map of Europe could shift, depending on whether the young king would one day produce heirs of his own. Within the palace, however, daily life continued with careful normalcy. Musicians played softly during dinners. Nobles attended formal audiences. Festivals were held, though less exuberant than before. Mariana ensured the court maintained dignity and routine, believing stability itself offered reassurance to the people. Evening often found her walking slowly through palace galleries lined with portraits of her ancestors. She looked upon generations of familiar faces, each one connected by blood. Those ancestors had arranged marriages to protect their lands. They had believed the family's unity would preserve peace. Now she stood among their images, aware that the same unity had created a fragile future. She did not question the past openly, because tradition remained powerful. Instead, she fulfilled her role faithfully, governing carefully and caring for her son with tireless attention. Her life became one of endurance, political endurance in council chambers and emotional endurance within private rooms. As night settled over Madrid and lanterns glowed along the palace courtyards, she returned to prayer once more. The quiet chapel, lit by candles, offered a moment of stillness away from advisors and expectations. There she asked not for greater power, but for simple continuity. For her son to grow, to live, and to secure peace for the kingdom. Through her we see the culmination of centuries of dynastic marriage. What began as a strategy to avoid war had produced a situation where the fate of empires rested upon one fragile life. The queens and mothers at the center of this system carried its heaviest burden, maintaining composure while uncertainty surrounded them. And as the palace sleeps and guards take their posts beneath the stars, we remain within this historical moment, where the destiny of nations rests quietly in a nursery chamber and in the patience of a queen who could not change the traditions that shaped her world. Now we move gently into the later years of Queen Mariana's life, when the young Prince Charles had finally grown into adulthood and taken the throne as King Charles II of Spain. The palace still stood grand and ceremonial, but its atmosphere had changed. Where once there had been hopeful anticipation for a strong future ruler, there was now careful management of a fragile king. Courtiers spoke more softly in his presence, and schedules were arranged to avoid exhausting him. The kingdom outwardly appeared stable, yet everyone quietly understood how delicate the situation remained. For Mariana, motherhood did not end when her son became king. Her influence shifted rather than disappeared. She stepped back from direct rule but remained a central figure within the palace. Advisors still consulted her privately, and ambassadors treated her with continued respect because she represented continuity in a time of uncertainty. Each day she followed a familiar routine, morning prayers, meetings with trusted attendants, and long hours observing the slow functioning of the court. The king's marriages now became the new focus of attention. Just as she herself had once been chosen to secure a bloodline, now brides were sought for Charles. The hope was simple: produce an heir and restore confidence across Europe. Yet the search itself revealed how closely connected the royal houses remained. Many suitable candidates were again relatives through multiple family branches. Diplomatic negotiations circled within the same extended network that had existed for generations. Charles married first a French princess, and the court celebrated with processions and feasts. Bells rang across the city and the people filled the streets with excitement. But months passed, then years, and no child appeared. Physicians offered remedies, priests organized public prayers, and rumors spread quietly through noble circles. When the queen died without producing an heir, worry deepened across the continent. A second marriage followed, this time to a German princess, again chosen through dynastic connection. The ceremony repeated the same hopeful pattern: celebration, expectation, and careful observation. Yet again, no heir was born. Now the issue could no longer be ignored. Diplomats from rival powers began discussing succession openly. If the Spanish king died childless, Who would inherit his vast territories? The answer could reshape Europe. Within the palace, Mariana watched these developments with calm restraint. She had spent her life maintaining stability, and she continued to do so through composure. She attended religious ceremonies, offered guidance when asked, and remained a reassuring figure to servants and nobles alike. But privately, she understood the situation. The generations of close marriages that had once promised unity now left the dynasty without a clear future. Her evenings were quiet. She often walked slowly along the palace corridors, passing the same portraits she had known for decades. Each face represented a ruler who believed the family line would continue indefinitely. Yet time moves differently than expectation. Traditions that appear permanent can reach their natural end. As the king's health weakened, preparations quietly began for what would come next. Councils met behind closed doors. Foreign ambassadors watched closely. Letters traveled quickly between European capitals. The people of Spain continued daily life. But among leaders, the coming change felt inevitable. Mariana spent long hours in prayer, not only for her son's comfort but for peace after his passing. She knew that succession disputes often led to war. Her hope was not merely for the family, but for the kingdom that depended upon stability. One winter evening, the palace grew especially still. The king's condition had worsened, and attendants moved carefully through dim corridors carrying messages between chambers. Candles burned late into the night. When Charles II finally died in 1700, the Spanish Habsburg line, after centuries of carefully preserved bloodline, came to an end. Mariana, now elderly, had lived to witness the full arc of the dynasty, its power, its careful marriages, and its quiet conclusion. She had fulfilled every expectation placed upon her, yet she could not prevent the outcome shaped by generations before her birth. Outside the palace walls, Europe prepared for conflict over the inheritance of Spain. Armies would soon march, and treaties would be negotiated. But within the palace itself, the moment was quiet. Servants moved respectfully, bells tolled slowly, and the corridors that once echoed with ceremony fell silent. As night settles again over the rooftops of Madrid, we see clearly what these royal women experienced. Their lives were not defined by personal choice, but by the preservation of dynasties. They carried responsibility for continuity, even when continuity proved impossible. And so we continue gently onward, understanding that their stories reveal not scandal or spectacle, but the human side of political tradition, a tradition that shaped kingdoms, families, and generations of queens who lived within its unchanging expectations. With the death of King Charles II, the long line of Spanish Habsburg rulers came quietly to its end, and Europe entered a moment of uncertainty. Yet rather than leaving our story in the noise of war and politics, we remain inside the palace itself, where daily life changed slowly rather than suddenly. Servants still prepared the morning fires. Guards still opened the gates at dawn. The chapel bells still rang at the same hour. Even as diplomats argued across continents, the rhythm within the royal residence continued with calm familiarity. The women who had lived within this system understood something deeply. Dynasties may rise and fall, but household tradition moves gently forward. Attendants trained under Mariana now instructed younger servants in the same gestures of courtesy she had practiced for decades. Bowing angles, formal greetings, and the quiet order of daily routines were preserved as carefully as crowns or documents. The palace itself carried memory through behavior. Let us imagine a young lady-in-waiting who had served in Mariana's later years. As a child, she watched the queen move patiently through her responsibilities, maintaining dignity even during uncertainty. Now grown, she teaches new attendants the same composure. Without realizing it, she passes along not only etiquette but the emotional discipline required in royal life. To speak calmly, to conceal fear, and to maintain harmony even when the future is unclear. Beyond Spain, other royal families observed what had happened. They did not immediately abandon cousin marriages because alliances still required trust. However, the extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line became a quiet lesson. Gradually, marriages began to include more distant relatives or foreign partners. The change was slow and cautious. Tradition never disappears overnight, but experience influences decisions. In courts across Europe, queens continued to carry the responsibility of succession, yet discussions about marriage alliances became more careful. Advisors considered not only political loyalty, but the strength of future heirs. Physicians, though lacking modern knowledge, began recommending broader unions when possible. Without using scientific terms, they sensed that variety in family lines improved outcomes. The memory of earlier queens remained present in letters and chronicles. Writers described their patience, devotion, and endurance. They rarely spoke openly about the biological reasons behind events, but they noted patterns: fragile children, repeated illness, and the pressure placed upon mothers. Over time, historians looking back would connect these observations to inherited conditions, yet in the moment people simply understood that something within the tradition needed gentle adjustment. Inside former Habsburg residences, portraits remained hanging on walls. Visitors walked through galleries seeing generations of rulers who had believed their family line would continue forever. The images no longer represented only power. They also represented the weight carried by the women who had ensured continuity for as long as possible. Their lives were quiet, disciplined, and often isolated, yet essential to the structure of medieval monarchy. As evening settles across Europe's many palaces, we pause to reflect on their shared experience. These women were honored publicly, yet privately they lived within expectations set centuries earlier. Their marriages united kingdoms, their children determined peace or conflict, and their personal feelings were rarely recorded. They became symbols of stability in a world that feared disorder. The candles burn low in the palace halls now, and servants close the tall shutters against the night air. The stone floors grow silent, and only the distant sound of a guard's footsteps echoes through the corridor. The dynasty that shaped their lives has passed, yet its influence remains in custom and memory. We continue gently onward, not toward battles or treaties, but toward understanding how these lives reflected a broader truth of medieval royalty, that preserving power often required sacrifice, and that behind every royal lineage stood women whose quiet endurance held kingdoms together far longer than anyone realized. As we continue our slow walk through this history, we step slightly away from Spain and look across the wider map of Europe, because the practice of closely related royal marriages was not limited to a single dynasty. The same ideas existed in France, in parts of Italy, in smaller German states and in several Eastern courts. Everywhere the reasoning sounded familiar. Trust family, protect inheritance, avoid rival claims. To rulers living in uncertain times, this seemed logical. Land meant wealth, and wealth meant armies. If property left the family through marriage, power could weaken. So families looked inward again and again. Within these courts, the daily lives of noble women followed a similar pattern. A princess spent her childhood in one palace, surrounded by relatives who were also political allies. From an early age, she was reminded that she represented more than herself. Every action reflected her lineage. She learned careful posture, measured speech, and the art of listening rather than interrupting. Even her handwriting was practiced until it appeared elegant, because letters between courts carried diplomatic meaning. Often she played with siblings and cousins who would later become rulers of neighboring territories. Childhood games were innocent, yet years later those same children would sign treaties or arrange marriages. The closeness of family created comfort, but also removed freedom. When the time came for her own marriage, the list of potential husbands usually contained familiar names. She might already know him from childhood visits, which seemed reassuring to the adults arranging the union. Her wedding was celebrated as a joyful occasion, but the celebration marked the beginning of a demanding life. She moved to a new residence, sometimes only a few days' journey away, sometimes across mountains and rivers. Everything felt both familiar and foreign. The language might be slightly different, customs slightly altered, but many faces were still relatives. She was not entering a new world entirely. She was entering another branch of the same one. Her responsibilities soon centered on childbirth. Court physicians tracked her health carefully, and religious ceremonies asked for divine blessing. Each pregnancy brought both hope and quiet anxiety. In some families, repeated intermarriage had already produced patterns of delicate health among children. Though no one understood the underlying reason, experienced attendants recognized caution was necessary. Daily routine offered stability. Mornings began with prayer and small meals. Afternoons included audiences, needlework, and correspondence. Evenings brought formal dinners where nobles discussed politics while she maintained polite composure. Outwardly, life appeared comfortable and ordered, yet inwardly she carried the expectation of producing heirs for an entire realm. Some women found influence within these limits. Through letters, conversation, and advice to their husbands, they shaped decisions quietly. Others lived more isolated lives, valued mainly for motherhood. Their personal wishes rarely appeared in official records. Chroniclers described their virtues, piety, obedience, grace, but seldom recorded their thoughts. Over generations, these patterns repeated across many courts. Family trees became increasingly interconnected. A ruler in one region might be cousin to rulers in 3 others. Peace was sometimes maintained because relatives hesitated to fight each other, but succession crises became more complicated. When a king died without heirs, multiple relatives could claim inheritance through shared ancestry. In the evenings, these queens often sat beside windows overlooking palace gardens. From outside, their lives seemed fortunate. They wore fine fabrics, lived within protected walls, and commanded respect. Yet their duties left little room for choice. Their marriages served diplomacy. Their children served succession. Their behavior served stability. As candles flicker along a quiet corridor and the night air cools the stone walls, we begin to see a common experience shared by many royal women across medieval Europe. They were the living threads holding together fragile political systems. The closer the families bound themselves, the safer rulers believed their power would remain. Yet slowly, without their awareness, that same closeness shaped the future of their dynasties. And so we continue gently forward, still within these peaceful palace interiors, understanding that the history of kingdoms was often written not only by kings and wars, but by the quiet, patient lives of queens whose marriages determined the fate of nations. As we move onward, let us pause in a quieter corner of this story and look closely at how these marriage traditions actually felt inside a single day of court life. The great political decisions happened in council chambers, but their effects appeared most clearly in ordinary routine. In a royal residence, dawn arrived softly. Servants opened wooden shutters, and a cool morning air entered rooms decorated with woven tapestries. The queen woke early, not because she wished to, but because her day followed ceremony as much as personal habit. Her first duty was prayer. The chapel stood only a short walk away, yet attendants still accompanied her. Religion in medieval courts was not separate from rule, it was part of it. She prayed for health, for peace, and most of all for children. The expectation of motherhood surrounded nearly every moment of her life. Even greetings from courtiers often included polite wishes for future heirs. After prayers, she met ladies-in-waiting who helped with letters and reading. Many of these women were also relatives, sometimes cousins sent to strengthen bonds between branches of the same family. Conversation remained gentle and formal. They spoke of festivals, births in other courts, and news carried by writers across Europe. Because families were so interconnected, a birth in one palace could affect inheritance in another hundreds of miles away. The midday meal followed strict order. Nobles sat according to rank, and servants carried dishes carefully across long tables. During these meals, visiting ambassadors watched closely. The queen's behavior reflected the stability of the kingdom. A calm, confident appearance reassured allies, while visible distress might encourage rivals. Even her health became a matter of diplomacy. Afternoons were quieter. She walked through gardens, embroidered cloths for church use, or read religious texts. Yet private discussions often took place during these calm hours. Advisors spoke gently about marriage alliances for younger relatives, considering which cousin might marry which prince. The decisions were not random. They were deliberate attempts to keep inheritance within trusted bloodlines. As evening approached, attention sometimes turned to her health. Court physicians asked about appetite, sleep, and signs of pregnancy. Their knowledge was limited, yet their concern was constant. Herbal remedies were prepared, diets adjusted, and rest periods recommended. These actions show that people recognized a pattern of difficulty even if they lacked explanation. If a pregnancy occurred, the palace atmosphere changed immediately. Messages rode across borders to inform related courts. Relatives offered congratulations, and churches held prayers. Yet beneath celebration existed careful watchfulness. Everyone hoped for a strong child who would grow safely. The queen herself often balanced hope with worry, aware that her personal well-being affected the future of the realm. Night brought formal dinners and music. Lutes played softly and candles illuminated painted ceilings. Guests saw elegance and order. They did not see the quiet exhaustion after long expectation, nor the emotional strain of repeated pregnancies. The queen maintained composure because royal dignity required steadiness in all circumstances. When she finally retired to her chamber, attendants prepared the room and withdrew quietly. Only then did she have moments of privacy. Some queens wrote letters to parents or siblings, sharing concerns more openly than official records ever reveal. Others prayed silently before sleeping, seeking reassurance in faith when certainty was impossible. Through these daily routines, we understand something important. The issue was not simply the marriages themselves, but the unchanging repetition across generations. Each individual union seemed reasonable in its time. Yet together, they formed a pattern that shaped families in ways medieval society could not yet understand. The castle grows quiet now. Guards walk slowly along the walls and moonlight rests upon the courtyard stones. Within these peaceful walls, queens carried both privilege and burden. Their lives were comfortable compared to most people of the age, yet their responsibilities were immense and unending. And as the night deepens around the sleeping palace, we continue our gentle journey through history, seeing how tradition, loyalty, and fear of disorder combined to create a system that shaped royal families for centuries. As our quiet journey continues, we begin to notice that medieval rulers did not ignore the difficulties entirely. They simply interpreted them differently. When royal children struggled with health, people of the time searched for explanations using the knowledge available to them. Physicians spoke of bodily balance, believing illness came from excess heat, cold, dryness, or moisture within the body. Priests spoke of spiritual testing. Astrologers examined the positions of stars at the child's birth. All of these attempts were sincere efforts to understand what they observed, yet none identified the deeper cause hidden within repeated family marriages. Within the palace, this meant that solutions were directed toward behavior rather than ancestry. Queens were advised to rest more, to change diet, or to avoid stress. Special pilgrimages were arranged to sacred shrines believed to protect mothers and infants. Relics were placed beside cradles. Holy water was sprinkled in chambers. The environment filled with careful protection, reflecting both hope and uncertainty. For the royal women themselves, these practices shaped daily life. A pregnant queen rarely moved freely. Attendants accompanied her everywhere. Meals were selected carefully, and sleep schedules were controlled. Even conversations around her were moderated to prevent emotional distress. The entire household adjusted its routine, because the birth of a healthy heir determined political stability. In many cases, the queen carried several pregnancies across her lifetime. Each one brought ceremony and preparation. Rooms were decorated, midwives assembled, and nobles waited nearby for news. When a child was born safely, celebration filled the court. Bells rang, cannons fired, and feasts lasted days. But if a child was weak, celebrations became quiet and prayer replaced music. Repeated loss created emotional strain rarely recorded openly. Chroniclers preferred to describe victories and treaties rather than private sorrow. Yet letters written between relatives sometimes revealed gentle concern and comfort offered across distances. Sisters wrote to sisters, mothers to daughters, sharing encouragement within the expectations of their world. Meanwhile, advisors continued arranging marriages for the next generation using the same methods. They still trusted familiar relatives more than unfamiliar rulers. The political logic remained persuasive. A cousin who shared ancestors seemed less likely to betray agreements than a distant stranger. Peace, they believed, depended on predictable loyalty. Over time, however, observers began to notice patterns. Some courts quietly sought more distant relations when possible. Others remained firmly within traditional practice. Change came slowly because altering custom risked political uncertainty. Stability was valued more highly than experimentation. In the evening hours, queens often found their only personal space. After ceremonies ended and attendants withdrew, they might sit beside a small window or candle. There they could reflect privately, away from formal roles. Many were devout, and prayer provided comfort. Faith allowed them to interpret events as part of divine order rather than personal failure. As night falls again over the palace roofs, the gentle sound of wind moves through the courtyard. The routine of guards, servants, and distant city life continues unchanged. Inside, the queens maintain dignity, carrying responsibilities beyond personal choice. They could not alter the tradition, but they endured within it with patience. And so we see that the story is not one of ridicule or spectacle, but of human adaptation to limited knowledge. People acted according to the understanding of their time. They sought stability through family bonds, unaware of the biological effects repeating across generations. The royal women lived at the center of this system, bearing both its honors and its hardships. The candles burn low now, and the palace grows silent. Our journey continues softly onward, deeper into the lives shaped by tradition, where power and vulnerability existed side by side within the same stone walls. As we move gently onward, we begin to see how memory slowly formed around these royal families. Medieval people did not think in scientific terms, yet they remembered patterns. Within certain courts, older attendants spoke quietly of how some royal children required more care than others, how tutors adjusted lessons to slower pace, and how queens prayed longer before each birth. These observations were never written openly as criticism. They were shared softly in conversation, carried from one generation of servants to the next. In the palace nursery, daily life centered on protection. Windows were covered against drafts, fires were kept warm but not hot, and physicians visited frequently. A royal child's health was not private, it was political. Courtiers waited anxiously for signs of strength, a steady appetite, clear speech, confident walking. Each small improvement brought relief across the court, because the future of inheritance depended on it. For the queen, this meant living in constant awareness. She balanced ceremony with motherhood. Mornings might begin with formal audiences, but afternoons often belonged to the nursery. She listened to reports from nurses, watched the child carefully, and consulted physicians about even minor concerns. When illness appeared, prayer and remedies filled the day. She remained composed in public, yet inwardly she carried deep responsibility. Marriage negotiations for the next generation began early. Even while children were young, advisors discussed future unions. Letters traveled between courts comparing ancestry and territory. The same reasoning repeated. Trusted relatives provided security. Some advisors began suggesting more distant connections, yet tradition still guided decisions. The memory of past alliances felt safer than uncertain alternatives. Portrait artists continued painting royal families, and their works now served another purpose. They were sent across Europe not only to show beauty, but to demonstrate lineage. Viewers recognized familiar features linking one branch of the family to another. These resemblances reassured rulers that the dynasty remained intact. even as quiet concerns persisted about health. Daily routine in the palace remained orderly. Music played during evening meals, candles illuminated halls, and festivals marked religious days. The public saw splendor, and to many people the monarchy appeared stable and powerful. Only those living inside the residence understood how much effort was required to maintain that appearance. The queens themselves developed remarkable patience. They learned to speak calmly under pressure and to maintain kindness toward attendants who shared their worries. Some became deeply compassionate, perhaps because their own experiences taught them vulnerability. They sponsored charities, hospitals, and religious houses, believing care for others brought both comfort and spiritual reassurance. As years passed, gradual change appeared. New alliances sometimes reached beyond the closest family lines. Not everywhere at once and not quickly, but slowly, rulers recognized that broader connections could still preserve peace. Without understanding genetics, they adapted through observation and experience. Evening returns once more to the palace. The corridors glow with lantern light and distant bells echo across the town outside the walls. Within her chamber, the queen kneels briefly in prayer before resting. Her life has been shaped by expectations older than herself, yet she has fulfilled them with dignity. She cannot rewrite tradition, but she can carry it with composure. And as the night grows still, we understand that these women were not merely figures in portraits. They were individuals living within a system designed to secure kingdoms, a system that depended upon them even as it limited their choices. Their quiet endurance formed an essential part of medieval political life, holding fragile stability together for generations. Now, as our journey continues, we begin to notice something subtle but important. Over long stretches of time, people rarely recognize change while they are living inside it. Yet slowly, across the late medieval and early modern centuries, attitudes toward royal marriage began to shift. Not suddenly, not through one decision, but through experience quietly accumulated within palaces. Courtiers had watched generations of queens fulfill the same role, arrive young, marry a close relative, and carry the burden of succession. They had seen celebrations at births, and they had also witnessed fragile childhoods that required constant care. Without speaking openly against tradition, advisors became more cautious. When discussing new alliances, they sometimes suggested partners from slightly more distant families, rulers connected politically, rather than only by blood. In council chambers, these discussions sounded practical rather than emotional. Advisors spoke about strengthening international ties, improving diplomacy, and preventing rivalry. Yet beneath these arguments lay a growing awareness formed by observation. Courts remembered which unions produced healthy heirs and which brought repeated difficulty. Knowledge came not through science, but through memory. Within the residence, queens themselves played a quiet role in this change. Through letters to siblings and relatives, they described daily experiences, the strain of repeated pregnancies, the worry during illness, the relief when a child recovered. These letters were private, never meant as political declarations, yet they influenced family conversations across borders. Mothers advised daughters gently. Aunts offered reassurance to nieces preparing for marriage. The network of royal women shared understanding across distance. At the same time, education expanded slightly. Tutors emphasized not only religious devotion but also practical household management and diplomacy. A queen might still not rule independently, Yet she became an important advisor within her court. Her experience gave weight to her opinion. When marriage discussions arose, her voice, though soft, sometimes guided decisions. Daily life in the palace continued calmly. Morning prayers, afternoon audiences, and evening gatherings filled the routine. Musicians played during feasts, and visiting nobles admired the order and elegance of court ceremony. To the outside world, the monarchy remained unchanged. Inside, however, perspective slowly broadened. Artists painting royal portraits also contributed unknowingly. By placing generations side by side in galleries, they allowed comparison across time. Observers noticed recurring resemblance, and while they still praised noble lineage, they also quietly considered its repetition. The idea that alliances could include more distant partners became less unfamiliar. For the women at the center of this system, life remained disciplined but meaningful. Many found purpose in education, religion, and charity. They founded schools, supported hospitals, and sponsored religious houses. Their influence appeared not through proclamations but through care. They created stability within households even when political circumstances were uncertain. As evening settles across a peaceful courtyard, we see a queen walking slowly along a covered passageway. Attendants follow at a respectful distance. She pauses to watch lantern light reflecting in a fountain. Her life has been shaped by decisions made before her birth. Yet she has shaped the lives around her through patience and example. Her children and their children will inherit not only a title, but the lessons she practiced daily: moderation, dignity, and caution. This gradual change would not end dynasties immediately, nor erase old customs overnight. But it began a long movement toward broader alliances. The idea of marriage as only family duty slowly expanded into marriage as political partnership between different houses. The shift was gentle, almost invisible while it happened. And so as the night air cools the stone walls and the palace grows quiet once again, we understand that the lives of these royal women influenced history in a quiet way. Without speeches or rebellion, their experience reshaped expectations. Tradition did not vanish, but it softened, guided by observation and human care. As we continue forward, the story now becomes less about a single dynasty and more about how memory itself reshaped royal behavior. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, European courts had quietly absorbed the lessons of the past. No one stood in a great hall and declared that the old ways had failed. Instead, the change appeared gently in the choices rulers began to make when arranging marriages for their daughters. Advisors still valued family alliances, but they now looked outward more often than before. A princess might be promised to a prince from a different kingdom rather than a close cousin. The reasoning was presented as diplomacy, strengthening peace across borders. Yet behind the explanation lay accumulated experience. Courts had seen how fragile succession could become when generations remained too closely connected. Stability required heirs, and heirs required careful consideration. Inside palaces, daily life remained familiar. Queens continued to wake early, attend chapel, and receive guests in formal audiences. The etiquette, the clothing, and the ceremonies changed little, yet their position felt slightly different. A queen arriving from a more distant court brought new customs, new conversation, and new perspectives. She was still expected to produce heirs, But she also became a bridge between cultures, rather than only a link within the same family circle. Letters between royal women now traveled farther across Europe. A queen in one kingdom might write to her sister in another country, sharing advice about motherhood, health, and court life. These letters carried warmth and personal concern alongside political meaning. Through them, royal families became connected by relationship rather than only ancestry. The nursery remained the emotional center of the palace. Attendants watched carefully over young princes and princesses, but now there was cautious optimism. Healthy childhoods restored confidence in the future. Celebrations after births felt less anxious and more hopeful. Even physicians, though still lacking modern knowledge, noticed improvement when marriages connected more distant families. For the queens themselves, life still required composure. They attended ceremonies, listened to petitions, and supported their husbands' rule. But they also gained a quiet authority as mothers of future rulers. Their advice carried weight because experience had shown how important their role truly was. While they rarely ruled openly, they influenced through counsel and example. In the evenings, they often gathered in small private rooms with trusted attendants. Conversation there was softer and more relaxed than in public halls. They spoke about children's education, religious duties, and the challenges of adapting to a foreign court. These moments offered companionship in a life otherwise shaped by formality. Across Europe, portraits of queens and their children were exchanged between courts. The paintings no longer emphasized only shared features of one lineage. Instead, they symbolized cooperation between different houses. Alliances expanded outward, and with them came a broader sense of stability. As dusk falls and lanterns glow once again along palace corridors, we see how tradition adjusted without disappearing. Royal marriage remained political, but its form evolved. Experience had taught rulers that preserving power required not only loyalty, but also balance. Within her chamber, a queen finishes her evening prayers and looks across the quiet garden. She understands her life serves a purpose larger than herself, yet she also feels a measure of peace. The generations before her carried heavy expectation, and through their endurance, new choices became possible. And so the story moves gently toward its conclusion, showing that history is often shaped not by sudden change, but by gradual understanding. The lives of these women, lived patiently within palace walls, helped guide royal families toward a more stable future. Now our long, quiet journey reaches its final moments. We have walked through many corridors and generations, from early medieval castles where marriage meant security, to later palaces where experience slowly reshaped tradition. And in each place, at the very center of the story, stood the royal women whose lives connected families, kingdoms, and futures. For the rulers of the past, the idea was simple. Keep power within the family and the kingdom would remain safe. They trusted blood because blood seemed reliable. Wars had often begun when inheritance was unclear, so marriages between relatives appeared to prevent conflict. In their understanding, they were protecting their people. They could not see what we see now. They acted according to the knowledge and fears of their time. Yet inside the palaces, these decisions became personal realities. A princess left her childhood home to marry a cousin she barely knew. A queen faced repeated pregnancies watched by an entire court. A mother prayed quietly for the health of a fragile child, while nobles discussed politics outside her chamber. Their lives were surrounded by ceremony, but also by responsibility that never truly rested. They lived with dignity because dignity was expected. They showed calm because stability depended on it. Their names entered chronicles, but their daily patience remained mostly unwritten. They woke early, attended prayers, listened to advisors, comforted children, and maintained harmony inside households that represented entire nations. Even when their choices were few, their influence was constant. Over time, the pattern taught its own lesson. Dynasties realized that preserving a kingdom required not only loyalty, but resilience. Marriages gradually widened, alliances extended farther, and the circle slowly opened. No proclamation announced the change. It came quietly, guided by memory and observation. The experiences of these women, carried across generations, helped shape that understanding. Now the castle grows silent. The torches along the walls burn low and the courtyard rests beneath moonlight. The portraits remain hanging in long galleries, watching over empty halls where footsteps once echoed. The rulers have passed. The courts have changed. Yet their stories remain gentle reminders of how history is lived not only by kings and battles, but by individuals fulfilling roles they did not choose yet carried faithfully. As we step away from these stone corridors, we leave them as they were, calm, dignified, and still. Their world fades softly into memory, and the lessons remain not as judgment, but as understanding.